My father-in-law showed up to Sunday dinner with a 19-year-old woman and introduced her as his fiancée. Within 4 days, she was locked inside the guest room at the end of the downstairs hall. By the third night, we could hear her crying out in the dark. And when my husband finally broke that door down, what was waiting on the other side wasn't anything we had imagined. Arthur Hendricks had lived alone in his house in Littleton, Colorado, since my mother-in-law Helen died 14 months ago. The house was a 4-bedroom craftsman he'd built almost entirely by hand when he was still working as a civil engineer. Wide plank floors, a wraparound porch, a back garden Helen had spent 20 years turning into something worth looking at. Irene, the woman who'd cooked and cleaned for them since before my husband Ben and I were married, still came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, even though Arthur kept telling her she didn't have to. Ben and I drove out most Sundays. His sister Amanda and her husband Craig usually came too. It was the kind of routine that grief creates. You keep showing up not because anyone asks you to, but because stopping feels like abandonment. That Sunday, Arthur called ahead and asked us to come a little early. He said he had news. Craig arrived first. He always did. He had this habit of walking into a room like he'd already been invited to sit down, loosening his collar before he even pulled up a chair. He sold commercial real estate and had a way of speaking in complete measured sentences that made him sound reasonable even when he wasn't. Amanda loved him for it. I'd spent 5 years quietly observing it. Arthur came downstairs in a pressed blue shirt, which was unusual. He normally wore flannel on Sundays. He stood at the head of the table and waited until we were all settled. Then he said, "I'd like you all to meet someone. Her name is Zoe. She'll be moving in by the end of the week. We're holding a small ceremony on Saturday." No one spoke for a full 4 seconds, I counted. Ben set down his fork. "What kind of ceremony?" "A commitment ceremony. Private, family only." Amanda's face had gone completely still. "Dad, how old is she?" Arthur looked at the tablecloth. 19. The chair scraped hardwood. Amanda was on her feet before I registered she'd moved. "You are 68 years old. Mom has been gone for 14 months. I know how long your mother has been gone." "Then how can you?" She stopped herself. Craig reached over and put his hand on hers. "Easy, honey." His voice was calm, practiced. But I caught his eyes in that moment. A brief, quiet flicker, like a man running a figure in his head and coming up satisfied. Ben asked where Arthur had met her. Arthur said through a mutual acquaintance. He said Zoe had been through a difficult period and needed stability. He said there was no reason to make assumptions before anyone had even met her. Ben asked about a marriage license. Arthur paused half a second too long. "Her documentation is currently being sorted out. We'll handle it legally once that's resolved." Private ceremony, no license. A 19-year-old with undocumented paperwork being moved into the house. I watched Arthur's thumb press a groove into the side of his water glass and thought, he is terrified. Not of us. Of something else entirely. Craig leaned back in his chair. "Dad, I want to be supportive here. But the family holds a stake in that commercial property on Wadsworth. If someone new enters this household, it would be prudent to clarify the ownership structure before any legal complications come up." He said it the way he said everything that mattered to him. Gently, with just enough concern in his voice that challenging him felt petty. Arthur looked at him. "You're not on that deed, Craig." "No, but Amanda is." The room went cold. Arthur excused himself before dessert. He went out through the back door and stood in Helen's garden for a long time, looking at the fence. By Wednesday, Zoe was in the house. Arthur had converted the guest room at the end of the downstairs hall, the one with its own entrance to the side yard, into something that looked less like a bedroom and more like a recovery suite. New curtains, a hospital-style bed frame on rental, a small mini-fridge humming in the corner, a blood pressure cuff on the nightstand. I only knew the details because Arthur had asked me to help him place a few orders online. I was a paralegal. He trusted me with paperwork and logistics. But when I printed the order confirmations, I noticed things I hadn't expected. Prescription-grade compression wraps, antiemetic medication, a pulse oximeter, high-calorie nutritional supplements used primarily in oncology and chronic illness recovery. I asked him, carefully, whether Zoe was sick. He took the papers out of my hands and folded them. "She has a condition. It's being managed." "Would it help to bring in a home nurse a few days a week?" "No, I'll manage it myself." He walked out before I could ask anything else. I stood in his kitchen holding my coffee mug, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Zoe arrived Saturday morning in a gray sedan that wasn't hers. She stepped out of the passenger side while Arthur went around to open the door, and I watched her from the porch. She was small. Thin in a way that worried you, not deliberately thin, but the kind that said the body had been running on insufficient resources for a long time. She wore a plain white sundress, and her hair was pulled back flat. She had a backpack on one shoulder and a plastic grocery bag in the other hand, and she kept her eyes on the path as she walked toward us. Amanda stood beside me, she said, under her breath. She dressed up for the occasion. Zoe stopped at the porch steps and looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Not from crying, I thought, from fatigue. She said, "I'm sorry to put everyone through this." Nobody answered. Not because we were cruel, because none of us knew what to do with that sentence. Arthur led her inside. He introduced her to Irene, who shook her hand and looked at her with the quiet, accumulated attention of a woman who has watched a family for 22 years and knows exactly when something doesn't add up. Later, after Arthur and Zoe had gone down the hall, Irene came and stood beside me at the kitchen counter. She said, without looking at me, "She hasn't eaten today, I can tell." Craig spent the afternoon in the living room talking to Ben about the Wadsworth property. Just being practical, he said. Just making sure everyone was protected. He had a folder in his briefcase. I noticed it when he set the case on the armchair. A legal-sized folder with color-coded tabs. I said nothing then, I just noticed. The door at the end of the hall stayed closed for 4 days. Arthur brought Zoe her meals on a tray. He knocked before entering and came back out with the tray half-finished. When Amanda tried to walk down that hall on Sunday, claiming she needed to offer a spare towel, Arthur stepped out of the kitchen and said, very quietly, "Please don't." Amanda called me that night from her car. She was crying. He talks to her more than he talks to us. He moved Mom's reading chair out of that room, the one she used when she was sick. He moved it out so Zoe could have more floor space. I understood why it hurt. Helen had spent 8 months in that room at the end. It wasn't just a guest room to Ben and Amanda. But I kept thinking about the oximeter, the compression wraps, the supplements. Amanda, does Arthur seem romantic to you, the way he acts around her? A pause. Not really, she admitted slowly. He talks about her like she's, I don't know, like she's fragile, like he's responsible for her. Okay. Don't okay me. Craig says, we need to move fast on the property trust. He says if her name gets attached to anything before we restructure. Amanda, don't let Craig draft anything without independent legal review. She went quiet, then softer. Do you think she's actually sick? I think something is very wrong in that room, and I don't think it's what we're assuming. The first scream came at 2 a.m. It pulled me upright before I was fully awake. Ben was already at the door. From downstairs, a high, strained sound, then something hitting the floor, glass or ceramic, and Arthur's voice, low and urgent, saying her name. Zoe, stay with me, look at me. Ben had his hand on the stair rail. I grabbed his arm. Wait. He looked at me like I'd made a serious mistake. I'm not saying we do nothing. I'm saying if we go down there half awake, not knowing what we're walking into, and it turns out to be a medical episode. Then we help her. Then we help. But let's understand the situation first. He waited, barely. The sound settled after a few minutes. Arthur's voice dropped to a murmur. The sharp noises stopped. We stood at the top of the stairs for another 10 minutes. When we finally went back to bed, Ben lay on his back staring at the ceiling. His voice, when he spoke, was flat and wrung out. What is actually happening in that room, Gwen? I didn't have an answer. Craig came by Tuesday with a document. He presented it at the kitchen table while Arthur was out picking up a prescription. He set it down in front of Ben and Amanda the way you'd set out a sensible suggestion. Casually, almost apologetically. It's a temporary proxy authorization, he said. Just to stabilize the family's position while things are unresolved. I'm not saying your dad doesn't have full capacity. I'm saying that if something goes sideways legally, you and Amanda should have standing to protect what your mother left you. I picked up the document. The first page was full of careful, reasonable language. Crisis management. Asset protection. Stability provisions. But by the third page, the proxy extended to commercial real estate decisions, including the Wadsworth property, for a period of 30 months. and the designated representative for executing those decisions, should Amanda be unavailable, was Craig himself. I set it down. This gives you 30 months of executive authority over a property worth roughly $800,000. Craig smiled at me. Patient measured. Gwen, it's standard protective language. It's not standard. Standard protective language doesn't redirect authority to a third party without independent disclosure to the principal. Amanda looked between us. Craig covered her hand with his. She's being overly cautious. That's what paralegals do. We have the luxury of time, I said. Nothing has been filed. Nothing has been signed. No one is taking anything from anyone right now. Craig's smile stayed exactly in place, but something behind it went still. Thursday night I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs for water and heard the side door open. I stepped out onto the back porch just in time to see Zoe standing at the garden gate with her backpack on. She was shaking. Not from cold. It was September and still warm, but from the inside. The way people shake when they've been holding themselves together for too long and the effort finally stops working. She saw me and went rigid. Please don't get Arthur, she said immediately. I can't do this anymore. I'm making everyone hate him. I'm not worth all of this. I walked toward her slowly. Where are you planning to go? She shook her head. I'll figure something out. You're 6, Zoe. I know what I am. I looked at the backpack. Old canvas, one strap held together with duct tape. Can I look inside? She hesitated. Then she unzipped it herself, like she wanted someone to see. No cash, no jewelry, no luxury items Arthur might have bought her. A few clothes, a phone charger, 2 blister packs of medication, a folded medical summary, and a photograph of a woman who had clearly been ill for some time. Gaunt face, soft eyes, a hospital gown visible at the collar. Your mom? I asked. Zoe nodded. She died 8 weeks ago. I looked at the top line of the medical summary before she folded it back. Autoimmune hepatitis, secondary complications, stage 3 fibrosis. The back door opened. Arthur stood in the frame in his robe, and his face was doing something I had never seen it do in the 6 years I'd been married to his son. Pure, undisguised terror, not the anger of a man whose authority was being questioned. The fear of someone losing something irreplaceable. Zoe, his voice was almost nothing. She closed her eyes. Come inside, he said. Please, we'll talk. You keep saying that. I know. Something cracked in his voice, just slightly. I know I do, I'm sorry. She let him lead her back in. At the door, she turned and looked at me. It wasn't the look of a girl who'd won the lottery. It was the look of someone who had been treading water for so long as her arms were giving out, and she didn't know whether being pulled back to shore was rescues or just a longer way of drowning. Friday morning, a man rang the front bell at 8 a.m. Late 40s, cheap flannel shirt, a truck in the driveway that had seen a lot of miles and not much maintenance. He introduced himself as Dale, Zoe's stepbrother. He said he'd driven up from Pueblo. Arthur let him in. Ben was already there. I stood in the kitchen doorway. Dale sat down at the table and placed a folder in front of him, like he was doing everyone a favor by showing up in person. I raised her after her mom got too sick to manage, he said. That costs money. Medical bills, food, gas driving her to appointments, lost wages. I got documentation. He pushed the folder across. Around $60,000. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for reimbursement. I picked up the papers. Several of the signatures didn't match the ink of the typed text above them. 2 of the dates corresponded to a period when, based on the medication schedule I'd seen in Arthur's kitchen, Zoe had been hospitalized. You don't sign legally binding financial documents from a hospital bed, unless someone puts the pen in your hand. These documents need forensic review, I said. Dale looked at me, the way men look at women they've decided not to take seriously. And who are you? A paralegal. Which means I know what backdated documentation looks like. Arthur had already moved to the hallway. He knocked on the room door and spoke quietly. A moment later, Zoe came out, supporting herself with one hand on the wall. When she saw Dale sitting at the table, she went very still. Dale's voice dropped into something soft and careful. Zoe, come on, you don't belong here with these people. Come home. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I signed those papers because you told me you'd have my mother's body cremated without a service if I didn't. Her voice was completely level. You still have my social security card, my birth certificate, and my mother's death certificate. The room had gone very quiet. Ben stepped forward until he was standing between Dale and Zoe. I don't think he planned it, he just did. Dale tried several explanations. Caretaking was expensive. She had episodes, she wasn't always reliable, she misremembered things. It wasn't fair to characterize what happened as anything worse than a family disagreement. Then let's let the police sort out what to call it, Ben said, and took out his phone. Dale's confidence cracked for the first time. He tried to stand. Arthur put his hand on the back of Dale's chair and said, very quietly, sit down. The responding officer arrived within 25 minutes. She reviewed the documents, noted the signature irregularities, took statements from Zoe and Arthur. Dale was escorted out. Not arrested on the spot, but informed clearly what a district attorney's office would be examining over the next several weeks. He drove away in the truck and left something heavy behind him when he went. That night, it happened. At 11:40, the sound came again, a sharp impact from behind the closed door, then Zoe's voice, high and fractured. I can't breathe, I can't. Ben was down the stairs before I cleared the bedroom door. By the time I reached the hallway, he was already pounding on the door with his fist. Dad, open it, right now. Silence. Dad, I will break this door down. 3 seconds. Ben went back 6 feet, lowered his shoulder, and ran at it. The second hit split the doorframe. The door swung hard into the wall, and we both stopped inside the threshold. Zoe was on the bed in visible distress. Her body rigid, her hands pulled into fists at her sides, her face twisted with an effort that had nothing to do with anger. Arthur was beside her with his hands on her arms, not restraining her, steadying her, trying to keep her from scratching through her own skin. On the nightstand, the pulse oximeter, an open pill organizer, a printed protocol sheet with a physician's name and an emergency line at the top. No champagne, no luxury, nothing except a sick young woman and an old man, trying to keep her from hurting herself in the dark. Amanda appeared in the doorway behind us. She put her hand over her mouth. Arthur looked up at us. He was exhausted in a way that lived below the surface, the flat, waterlogged look of someone who has been running on nothing for weeks and knows it. He said, give me a few minutes, and then I'll tell you everything. We waited in the hallway. Irene appeared from the kitchen with glasses of ice water for all of us without being asked, the way she always managed to appear with exactly the right thing when everything else was going wrong. Arthur came out and closed the door behind him. He said Zoe was not his fiancée. The ceremony had been a cover, a temporary, badly thought-out cover he'd constructed in a panic, thinking it would buy him time. He had never intended it to become what it became. He understood that didn't make it better. 8 weeks ago, he had received a letter postmarked from Pueblo. It came from a woman named Carolyn, someone he had known briefly, a long time ago, before he met Helen. He'd ended the relationship. He had not known she was pregnant. He acknowledged that was also the easiest version of the truth to tell himself, and he'd spent the last 8 weeks sitting with that. Carolyn had raised Zoe alone for 19 years. She'd said nothing, asked for nothing. When her illness progressed to the point she couldn't manage, she made arrangements. She wrote the letter. She asked a neighbor to mail it after she was gone. The letter told Arthur he had a daughter, that she was sick, that her stepbrother had been exploiting her for 2 years, controlling her identification documents, forcing her signature on financial instruments she didn't understand, and that Carolyn had no one else to ask. Arthur had demanded a DNA test before anything else. He showed us the certified lab results, 99.6% probability of paternity. Amanda sat down on the hallway floor with her back against the wall. Not dramatically. Her knees simply stopped holding her. Ben read the letter twice, folded it, and held it. He said, "You could have told us." Arthur said, "I know. From the beginning, any of it, you could have just said, 'I know.'" Arthur's hands were shaking slightly. I was ashamed. And I was afraid you'd think she was here to take something that belonged to your mother. And I was afraid that if I told you the truth, you'd never look at me the same way. He paused. By the time I understood that hiding it was making everything worse, I'd been hiding it long enough that I didn't know how to stop. Ben didn't respond. Amanda was crying quietly on the floor. Irene had gone back to the kitchen because she always disappeared when the family needed the privacy of a closed door, and she was the one who had to create it. Craig arrived the next morning with his briefcase. He didn't know yet what had happened. He came in with his usual energy. Coffee offers, easy small talk, a smooth pivot toward the proxy document he'd left 2 days ago. I had a folder of my own on the table. 3 months earlier, Craig's development company had defaulted on a commercial loan. The lender had granted a 60-day extension. That extension expired in 9 days. The Wadsworth property, the commercial lot Amanda had inherited from Helen, was appraised at just above the amount he owed. I laid the loan default notice on the table, then the appraisal, then a printout showing his company's registration date alongside the proxy document's creation date. Then a note from a county clerk's office confirming that no independent legal review had been sought before the document was presented to Amanda for signature. Craig tried 3 versions of an explanation. The loan was being restructured. The proxy was standard language. I was drawing connections that weren't there. Amanda had picked up the proxy document and was reading the 3rd page for the first time. She'd signed the bottom of it while she was upset about Zoe, and Craig had told her it was just about protecting what her mother had left her. She put it down. She looked at her husband and said, very quietly, "Did you use my grief to try to steal from my family?" He started to answer. She said, "Don't." She stood up, took her keys from the counter, and walked out through the back door. She stood in Helen's garden for a long time. When she came back in, she didn't look at Craig. He left an hour later. He took the briefcase. He filed for bankruptcy 3 weeks after that. Amanda's attorney, one she hired independently, without any recommendation from Craig, determined that the proxy document was unenforceable because the third-party authorization clause had not been disclosed to her at signing. Craig had never had any legal claim to anything. He'd just been hoping no one would read to the 3rd page in time. Dale was charged with identity theft and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Colorado statute. The case worked its way through the system over the following months. Zoe had her Social Security card back within the week, retrieved by law enforcement when they searched Dale's truck. Arthur filed for legal parentage. The process took several months, required documentation, and a court date neither Ben nor Amanda contested. Zoe spent 3 more weeks in the guest room before transferring to an outpatient specialist program at a hospital in Denver. Her condition, autoimmune hepatitis with secondary complications, was serious, but the specialist she saw said it was manageable with consistent treatment. She had been undertreated for 2 years. That explained the compression wraps, the oximeter, the protocol sheets, and the middle-of-the-night crises. Amanda and Zoe didn't have a tearful reconciliation scene. What actually happened was that Amanda showed up one Tuesday afternoon with a container of Irene's green chili and set it on the nightstand without saying much. Zoe said thank you. Amanda said, "You're welcome." They sat together in that room for about 20 minutes without talking, which, given everything, was as close to a beginning as either of them could honestly manage. Ben took longer. He went for a lot of runs in the weeks after. He came home quiet and made dinner and stood at the kitchen window longer than necessary while things came to a boil. One evening he said, "I keep trying to figure out who I'm supposed to be angry at and I can't land on anyone." I said, "I think it might just be the situation." He thought about that. That's a very unsatisfying answer. Yeah, but probably accurate. He drove Zoe to her 3rd follow-up appointment because Arthur needed to rest. He sat in the waiting room and read a 6-month-old issue of Sports Illustrated and got them both coffee from the machine down the hall. When she came out, she said her numbers were better. He said that was good. She said, "Yeah." He said, "Let's get lunch before we drive back." And she said, "Okay." They talked about whether the Rockies were ever going to put together a real season. They talked about whether Irene's green chili was the best in the state, or if they were just biased from years of eating it at family dinners. They didn't talk about anything that mattered, which was its own kind of talking. Irene put a small potted succulent on Zoe's windowsill the week she came back from the hospital for the last time. Arthur said that was thoughtful. Zoe said she'd never had a plant before and wasn't sure she'd know how to keep one alive. Irene said it was a succulent. "You water it when the soil gets completely dry and otherwise you leave it alone," she said. "You'll figure it out." And in a family that had been locked up tight for too long, secrets stacking up behind closed doors, people choosing silence because the truth felt like too much to carry, that was enough of a place to start.